Hey, thanks very much, Cheryl, for joining me for this discussion. You and I connected, I think, about a month ago over LinkedIn, and have had some good discussions between now and then. And I thought it'd be really useful for my audience to hear a bit about the work that you do, because there's quite a lot of crossover between what I'm talking and thinking about a lot and the space that you work in. So I wondered if you could start by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about what you actually do.
Sure, thanks very much. And it's great to be with you, Tim. Thank you. And you're absolutely correct. You know, the work that you're doing and the work that I'm still working on and always aiming to improve is ensuring that we actually have an education system that benefits everyone. And for me to achieve that, so that everyone is participating in that future and that vision, I drilled down and developed what I call first principles on education. So basically, everything that I do and do now and will do in the future is based on the work that I've done to understand what is important to have appropriate values and beliefs that enable us to drive what it is that we do. And then on the flip side, when we run into strife or we have conflict or we have any issues, then we can work backwards again to those fundamental principles and see where we need to affect that change. And also with that, accept that sometimes a quick fix might be required as well. So, you know, I talk about band-aiding, and sometimes it's actually, a band-aid measure might be appropriate, conditional that it doesn't stay there and more band-aids keep getting tapped in to any issue. We still have the ability to pare back and look at the fundamental issues and beliefs that are driving our actions and our culture.
So you've mentioned the phrase first principles, and you just then mentioned the word beliefs. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by first principles and beliefs? What exactly are we talking about there?
Okay, so it's really quite interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about first principles and you talk about beliefs, we're really talking about the values that we have and what we believe and how they play out as well. So, as a, for example, with the law, we have fundamental laws, a principle of fairness that drives law and order. However, for those to play out, we might have and do have policies or legislation or ministerial orders and things like that. And at the school level, all of that affects all that we do. So often, however, we're not attuned to that depth and we focus on the day-to-day issues that are driving what's happening in schools and school behaviours and so forth. And that can be where we fall into traps of not fully understanding one another's point of view or vantage point, as I like to say, and what that vantage point will mean, in particular when there's difference. And this comes back to your work. So if there's difference, where do we go from there and how do we resolve that?
So how does a deeper understanding of our values and beliefs, how does that actually help when we talk about differences? And we might be talking about different, clashes between staff or potentially clashes between students or maybe even between families and the school. So how does a focus on values help us move forward or maybe even prevent those things from happening in the first place?
Okay, so essentially, without having a set of values or a set of fundamental beliefs, then we're open to a lack of agreement. And I start talking with clients and families in particular around what I call a shared language of agreement, because essentially it's all about our language that drives everything that occurs. And if we take, for example, even the word woke at the moment, everyone's talking about woke and all the things that underplay that and the certain values that we have and the way society has changed so rapidly. When we start to unpack that, we start to identify that perhaps someone isn't thinking the same way that someone else is thinking purely because of the language they're using. If I could simplify that, I use the word sick a lot to explain this. So, for an adult, sick means not well, but for youth, it might mean fantastic or cool or awesome. And so they're both correct, but we have to have agreement in a particular context which one we're going to use. And that helps us um, unpack what it is that we're really trying to achieve. Because at the end of the day, schools are there to assist families or parents to raise their children effectively. And
Is
so
sick a word that young people are still using these days? I think it's slay, isn't it?
it's probably me that's thinking that, you know, back in my day, to be honest, but it's a good example.
That's all right. People my age understand what you're talking about, so that's
Yes,
fine. You got the message across.
good stuff.
Yeah, so well, let's talk about the I guess culture wars, and even that phrase is very loaded. I don't like to use it, and you've mentioned the word woke. I find that very unhelpful as well because what it meant originally, its meaning has changed and morphed into something that has now become quite divisive. This is something that I see in my work is that the cultural changes, the changes in the way people are thinking about values, thinking about concepts like truth, authority, all those sorts of things, which can be described as the culture wars. I find that schools are caught right in the middle of that. It seems to be a battleground, if you like. And at least in my work, I'm seeing what you've just talked about, where there's misunderstandings about, how do we determine what the truth is, and those sorts of really fundamental, deep philosophical questions, and they then play out and end up creating clashes, which then result in investigations having to be carried out. So I wonder what have you got to say about that?
Well, you're spot on. And one of the biggest challenges we've had is that we don't think deeply enough. We don't talk deeply about philosophy, and philosophical conversations are very, very rare. And which means that debate becomes very shallow. And we're unable to accept differences because we're not prepared to have those difficult conversations when something really does come up and is important to discuss. Uh, the result of that is in fact, in my view, and the work that I see, is that educational settings, be it in entire systems or schools or clusters within schools or so forth, having an educational philosophy is missing, because the deep thinking that we would have done many years ago is not there. And there's an acceptance of the norm, and there's an acceptance of following the pack. And we've created, and again, it's a word that's used with woke, unfortunately, but this tribalism. And so we'll join packs rather than, have that conversation to bring us together, even if it means accepting difference, but accepting a way forward. That's the most important thing. We have to accept difference, but it must be fair for everyone at the end of the day, and everyone must benefit from the outcomes we've decided to work with.
I don't know whether this is related. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I'll be interested in your perspective on this. One of the trends that I'm seeing, which is related to this idea of tribalism, again, I'm going to use another loaded term, which is cancel culture.
Mhm.
This idea that as soon as we see someone behaving in a way that we think puts them in the opposite camp to us, we're very quick to criticize, critique, and what I see is people essentially being put on trial in the public arena. Maybe it's just through the rumor mill or gossip, but essentially put on trial, and factual findings essentially being made against people when no formal investigation has actually been carried out. And that's extremely dangerous. There's been a case in the UK, a university, where someone tragically took their own lives, and there was some commentary in the media around this. Is that something you're seeing?
Oh, absolutely. And we can take anything that's going on in the media, in fact, and identify that we're not getting investigative journalism in a way that we would have in the past. So we're open to perspective and point of view as opposed to fact and truth telling. And you're absolutely right. And then to take that a step further, whose responsibility is it to identify those facts? And what business is it of everyone to have that opinion that escalates an issue, uh, when in fact we're better off to allow those who are directly involved to work towards resolution. So we've become voices of all things without increasing and encouraging the healthy benefits of fact finding and truth, as you just said. So, you know, it's all about opinion. It's all about, and it's too often about emotion. You know, people hurt. People do bad things. We all are guilty of, I think, in some way, shape, or form over our lifetime, having been bullied or bullied, be it, you know, in an enormous way or very subtly. And perhaps bully's the wrong word there, because, you know, when, you know, bullying tends to be that, or abuse is, you know, the constant behaviour that's ongoing. Bullying could just be being mean for a day or so, I don't know, as an example. But we've become extremely precious about what's going on, rather than accepting, you know, what has happened and finding ways to move forward and have resolution.
Yeah, and the concept of bullying, abuse, we could probably throw sexual harassment in there. From my perspective, uh, if we don't allow people to go through that process of an investigation, and which should be underpinned by, you know, natural justice or due process, depending on where you come from, to me that creates some massive issues for both the victims or complainants, depending on which label you use, and the person who's actually accused of it, in terms of their psychological well-being moving forward. It just doesn't resolve things if people are instead, you know, vilified without actually having a chance to have their say.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about education settings, it becomes extremely challenging, because that whole principle of fairness and you know, having clear and consistent laws that are applied equally actually fall apart when we start looking at due process, or what is supposed to be due process in the education settings. To give you one example, and something that I've been through personally many years ago, but the whole concept of concern versus complaint. And so, you know, there was a constant raise your concerns, and that kept it at a local level, when in fact it had to be escalated right through to the top of the wazza, and a formal complaint, not just because of what had occurred in my instance, but the effect it had on all families in the state and indeed the country. Well, of course, there were gatekeepers to prevent that from happening. And then, of course, you become a whistleblower if you keep going. And then, of course, the vilification escalates to the point that your behaviour is perceived to be what you're accused of in the first place, which makes you even more frustrated because of that, as you said, lack of due process or natural justice.
Yeah, and there's a balance to be struck there, I think, because on the one hand, we don't want to be soliciting formal complaints left, right, and centre, otherwise we wouldn't ever get anywhere. But on the other hand, I think we need to be suppressing unnecessary gossip and slander, if you like. Um, and I have that conversation with some of my clients as well, where there are sort of rumours floating around. You know, there are concerns, as you said. No one actually wants to come forward and make a complaint, though. And then you might have people wanting to make complaints but do it anonymously, which causes some massive issues
Mm.
for a school trying to then conduct any sort of formal process. Is that something you've seen as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest issues is that it does come back to, and this is why first principles are so important for me, uh, was asking constantly, what caused this? How could it have been prevented? Or what actions happened in order for it to be escalated? How did I react? How did they react? And so these what and how questions drove me to keep going further down, down, down to find out what those core issues were. And as I said earlier, you know, first principle being the shared language of agreement is critical. But then taking it further, one of the most important ones for me in the education space is the distinction between child and student. So when you've got a community of families and you have a community of educators and a community of students, who's responsible for the day-to-day behaviours of everyone within the school setting, and what is the impact outside of the school setting and vice versa. That's where we quite often run into strife, because decision making is taking place, be it because it's perceived to be an authority, someone has the authority to do so, or it's because of relinquishment, or it's for other reasons. And we have to remember that we really are just dealing with, and not just in a loose term, but importantly, we're dealing with communities of families, and educators have their own families as well. And we've really got to come down to how it is that we can use first principles to work together more effectively to avoid, as what you said, concerns and complaints and the need for whistleblowing, etc.
I'm interested in that distinction you've made between the two terms, child and student. Tell me a bit more about that.
Okay, so if you think about education, we talk about education being something that's lifelong, and that's effectively something that we've all accepted to be the case. And education being lifelong means that we're constantly learning, we're constantly teaching. So from the context of a young person who enters school, their education is taking place at school whilst they're there. But outside of school, their education is constantly evolving through other social and community settings, including the home and extended family, peer groups, clubs, faith groups, etc., etc. So the influence on that child's life is quite vast and quite extensive. Yet we continue the narrow playing field that there's a partnership between home and school, and that doesn't extend sufficiently conversationally to the community, nor do we respect the wider community and offer them the same, I suppose, influence and power that schools are offered and provided.
Okay. I'm interested in your take on the clash that we're starting to see now. And I think educational institutions often are caught up in this. The clash between the right to free speech, the right to express your views on religion or your political views, versus the responsibility on schools to, for example, protect their staff in terms of their psychological well-being, and the discussions around hate speech as well. From what I can see, we're starting to find the limits now of liberalism. This idea that everyone's rights can be protected, because now we're starting to see some of those rights actually clash with each other. What thoughts do you have around that, and what are you seeing in the education sector?
Well, in my view, there's an imbalance of legal protections, and that, particularly in the school setting, the way we employ educators, whether or not they are all for being a member of a union or not, generally speaking, they're bound by union agreements and arrangements that have been determined. Sure, that there's some say with the members, but by and large, the unions and the governments get together and negotiate on behalf of the union membership. If you're not a union member, that is still sitting there as an EBA, and so on it goes on. So one of the issues I have, this whole imbalance, and what we see is that we have a very narrow funnel through which we employ educators. And if we expanded that funnel and had a raft of teacher certifications, a range of teacher certifications, then the experiences, the conversations, the knowledge and the respect would be far greater and far wider. And that's endemic right in schools, that we don't have that at the moment. And that's also very much around, our concerns in Australia, and I know New Zealand is similar, and other places around the world, USA, where there is a narrow playing field from which teachers are educated in order to become teachers, or pre-service teachers become teachers. And that's, through our universities and what's been happening there. So the reason why I give this example is that, again, we're talking about at the school. However, in order to rectify it, we have to pare back and find out how they got into that role in the first place and what it was that has caused this constant flow of these issues taking place in schools.
So what you're saying is that we're getting, if I'm hearing you rightly, we're getting a certain type of person with a certain type of background uh, as teachers, and you're saying that needs to be broadened. Is that right?
I'm saying we need to diversify the value we have for educators, respect that there are a variety of ways in which people can be certified to become educators in schools. I'll stop there and just take back one step here. We talk about the role of schools being to assist students in reaching their full potential. And I challenge our educators to say that they have reached their full potential as educators. And by and large, they'll say no, because they're not teaching what they love. They're not fulfilled in their role. They're teaching out of field, so they're under pressure and stress. They're affected by things that we've just said there, where we don't have sufficient bridges of support nor boundaries around that child-student differentiation. So teachers are under the pump to, if you will, roll with the punches with whatever's going on in society. And by doing so, it's actually contributing to what's going on in society. So we need to broaden our scope much, much more for teachers to be the professionals that they aspire to be and deserve to be seen as.
Okay. So when schools and families are coming into conflict, in your experience, what are the common root causes of those conflicts or complaints, shall we say?
Okay, the first thing I'll say is relationships. And, the relationship between family and school is obviously a critical one for that mutual respect, and respect for difference is the same as sameness. And if we're not communicating effectively, then that relationship is compromised. And by communication, we've already talked about a shared language of agreement so that we understand what it is that we're discussing in certain areas, or all areas of education, in fact. More importantly, having that respect that we should have, and that is home is the first priority. And that's one of the principles I hold, that parents are responsible for raising their children with the support of schools and other service providers. And, we need to, in my view, invest more in supporting families in taking responsibility for the responsibility they have to one another. And if we focus on that more, then there's greater, in my view, great opportunities for greater engagement around the important decision making that schools have to make. I'll give you a quick example, and it's one that everyone would be familiar with, and that is the introduction of smartphones and one-to-one computer devices in schools. Now, it was seen to be the best thing since sliced bread, and it was embraced, and it was escalated so rapidly without due diligence, without a deep conversation about our philosophical values, about the impact of that on the lives of everyone involved, not just financially, but health, time, etc., etc. I mean, the list goes on. It was embraced and not questioned in many respects. Now, fast forward a decade later, we're up in arms trying to get rid of them because of the problems they've caused. So, this is what I mean by, families having the confidence to question, schools encouraging that questioning. Likewise, schools having the appropriate background knowledge that they're imparting to families to justify their views as to why something like that would be important. So parents can say, I agree or I disagree. And then the relationship starts to flourish and we start to get to the core principles and values that we hold and determine how we're going to deal with that within a given setting or school, community by and large.
Those conversations would be quite robust, wouldn't they?
They have to be.
Yeah.
They have to be. And this is the great thing. And I know that with your work, you're heavily involved in dispute resolution and complaints and sorting all of that sort of thing out. And I deliberately went and completed a course on mediation to understand the processes involved in dispute resolution better, and understand how to work with people in conflict, not because I wanted to be a mediator, but because I wanted to be able to identify how we can work during these difficult conversations, because by the time you reach mediation point, you're already at that stress level of, oh, we've gone too far. And, I firmly believe that mediation is valuable and important, but we want the reduction of that by coming back to these core principles in the first instance.
I provide training to schools on how to conduct really good quality disciplinary investigations involving students, right? So, your bullying, violence, even cyberbullying, all those sorts of issues that schools are now facing. And one of the pain points that I'm often hearing about from teachers is the role that parents play in those investigation processes. And parents obviously have a right to be involved, but that can be a really difficult process to try and navigate when you've got parents sitting in on interviews, for example, or parents wanting updates on investigations, asking for information. What comments have you got about those processes, Cheryl, from your experience?
But the first thing to consider is, what is the issue, where has it taken place, and who's responsible in the long term? And if there's already this divisive conversation taking place as, does a parent have a right or do they not have a right, we've already got serious problems. And, if a school doesn't have sufficient rules and policies and processes in place when there is conflict or bullying, or whatever it might be, that's causing a lack of harmony within the community, then there's a serious issue at play. And parents are very much responsible for knowing what they are. And our school boards are key to ensuring that the community is well and truly aware, because the school board is there to represent the community, and it has its representatives being, members of government or unions, the staff and leadership of a school, and the parent community. And in many instances, we've got students on school boards now too. Now, if that school board can't have robust conversation, and if that school board can't ensure that policies and processes are not understood and agreed to across the community, then of course there's going to be problems. So that's really the point at which, relationships and language are key, and first principles naturally as a result of that.
Yeah, and one of the discussions I'm having and one of the services that I'm providing is helping schools to put together standard operating procedures in relation to those student disciplinary investigations. And one part of that is knowing at which point do we involve parents in the process, because it just does seem to be a bit of a grey area for some schools. And it's not necessarily their fault. It's just we've got to, our culture is changing in some ways. Some parents are wanting more involvement. And I think that's a really important thing for schools to think about, having a clear pathway for any staff member just to be able to look at the policy and go, okay, this is the situation. Yeah, it meets the threshold where we get parents involved.
Well, there's another side to it as well. Because there seems to be this constant, parent versus teacher or family versus home narrative that unfolds, and that's why, that principle of child and student are not synonymous is so important for me. However, back to that, if there's an issue with a child who happens to have the student cap on because they're inside the school gate, then they need fair representation. And if it's not their parent, it must be somebody else. We've got a child dealing with an adult or a group of adults. And if that adult or group of adults aren't equipped to manage any misconduct or bullying, etc., or let's not forget, it's, if I dare I say, protection of their environment, which they've got a right to do, but also be impartial as to what's occurred in that environment, that student is, or child, student, is on their own. And that's a very, very challenging thing for parents. And I dare say it's challenging for teachers when there's a lot of weight given the other way, as you've mentioned.
Well, this comes back to natural justice principles, which is what I'm banging on about constantly in my training and all the other conversations I have. Is we've
Love
got
it.
to come back to natural justice, due process, and one of the principles there is, yeah, if the potential outcome is disciplinary, then we need to be thinking about what representation or what support that student has through the process. Now, that might be a trusted teacher, another staff member. It may be a family member, or it may be someone else from within the community. But we need to be thinking about that with students and not just rushing into a process. And of course, I balance that with the knowledge that these processes are often on a very tight time schedule. So it's very challenging for schools to manage.
That's true. And, the biggest issue we have there, again, as you said, with this due process and representation, is what is the outcomes that we're all wanting to achieve? And that outcome should come back to those first principles as well, is that we are a community of families that are there for everyone to benefit. And if we're constantly, and I'm sure you're seeing this, the number of suspensions that happen, the number of expulsions that take place. And so what, in dealing with that, are we saying, look, this is too hard for our environment, we'll just handball that child and family to another school and let them deal with it? They're still within the school system, they're still within wider communities. So where's the failing? Is it, as you said, the process? Is it a lack of core principles that everyone agrees to and therefore relationships have broken down? That's always the case, relationships have broken down. But ultimately, what is the benefit of the student being expelled? And if it's because there are absolutely fundamental differences in beliefs, it makes sense that that student moves on. But if it's a case of a demand from one side that is unreasonable and due process hasn't occurred, we've got real problems across the systems.
Well, I'm going to throw a couple of ideas at you, which I've come across since kicking off my business. One is a real divide, and I think this comes back to values, beliefs, a real divide between those who think that we should be aiming for a punitive approach. So those who would say, well, we're just being too soft on these students. If they've misbehaved, in fact, we should be suspending more students. We should be kicking more out of our schools because we've got to take a hardline approach to issues like bullying. So, and then there's another camp which says, well, actually, we'd like to see more restorative outcomes. So that's one divide that I'm seeing, the divide between punitive versus restorative. And then the other dynamic that I'm seeing is the pressure now on schools to, under legislation, so health and safety legislation, to provide a safe working environment. And that starts to become relevant when we're seeing students, for example, being abusive towards teachers. And now teachers are saying, well, hang on, I don't actually feel safe in my work environment. So as a school, what are you going to do about that?
Right. So the key to what you're talking about here is, what is a school? And what is the model of schools and schooling that we have? And much like I said earlier around the narrow funnel for those that become educators that work in our schools, we have a very narrow funnel for what a type of school is. And if we have the assumption that a school has to be a particular way, and all schools are that particular way, we're not offering choice and diversibility that we require. Having said that, we need a system of consistency for society. So this whole balancing act is really important as to what a school offers in the first instance and how we can actually flexibly offer a system that offers a range for the various personalities and so forth and needs of students and desires of teachers to work, without compromising the rule of law and the importance of what we've been discussing, having a genuine balance of legal protections for everybody.
So to put you on the spot, do you, if we look at the swing between restorative processes versus punitive, do you think we've swung too far one way or the other, or what's your take on where we're at the moment?
Look, my take is that we've become far too soft. My take is that, much like we discussed at the beginning of our conversation, we've become so precious that everything is offensive. And, I'm sure you'd know this. I mentioned sick earlier. So I'm sure you'd be familiar with this, the old one of, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. It's an old adage and it makes sense. When are we going to, start taking responsibility for how we speak to others, for example, and how we behave towards others, in realising the impact that it may have, which is where our restorative practice comes in. On the other hand, it's having the foundations to know when behaviour is and isn't appropriate. So we've got this real melting pot of expectation at the moment, and we've got too many victims with insufficient discipline.
I'm sure there'll be people watching or listening to this who will disagree with you, Cheryl, but that's the whole point of these discussions, isn't it? We're allowed to disagree on that, and it's good to have debate about it.
Yeah, look, I'd love to, just on that, I'd love to see that we have a greater awareness of the sense of community where we become responsible for one another and with one another. And, I'd love to see more cadets in schools. I'd love to see, greater engagement of groups outside of school settings that encourage that sense of community and responsibility in peers, and take the onus away from the schools to be the responders when behaviour is inappropriate, and rather get back to what their core goal is, and that is to deliver an agreed curriculum. So the distractions that are taking place that you're talking about are because we have moved away so much from what was fundamentally the desire for fairness and that responsible freedom that we're talking about.
Yeah, those decisions are so difficult. I mean, I personally feel very sorry for school leaders these days having to make those decisions, and people who sit on boards around suspensions, expulsions, those sorts of things. One of the issues that I'm often talking about with schools is the investigation processes often simply aren't thorough enough or aren't robust enough, and that's simply through a lack of training, which is the gap that I'm filling. And especially around the interviewing of students, those conversations that we're having with students. And what I find is that if we have good quality interviewing practices, asking good questions, having a good process that we can go through, what that does is not just allow us to get the information we need to have to be able to suspend a student, but actually to go deeper and start uncovering underlying motivations for behaviors, the root causes of the issues, which I think probably goes back to those ideas that you're talking about in terms of first principles, values, and those sorts of things. So it allows us to actually go really deep and work out what is actually sitting in behind this issue, which then gives us as leaders more options in terms of how we respond to it, whether it is something punitive or it can be a more restorative approach. But if we don't actually have the information, if we're not getting beneath that surface level, we just can't make those decisions in the first place, which I think that's a really big issue.
It is indeed. And one of the challenges with all of that as well is you talk about teacher wellbeing and teacher support. And we have to be very mindful that we're not, and I think we already have, I shouldn't say we're not, that we've created an environment, again, where, you know, there are victims all the time, and it's easier to do things that resolve that mentality rather than have these difficult conversations that you and I are talking about today, and that is getting to the core of these issues. Principals actually and school boards have far greater authority than they're applying. And that's really the work that I'm very keen to expand on, so that school communities are being supported by their leadership at that school level, by the school boards having those very critical conversations and taking on board the autonomy that's already sitting there for them. Overnight, they can change their curriculum. Overnight, they can extend their school hours. Overnight, they can reduce, holiday periods at peak times. Overnight, they can do so much with their resources once they know what independence they actually have within the law. And that would certainly go well towards the fantastic work that you're working on as well.
Let's talk about one of the biggest challenges schools are facing, I think, in 2025 and probably for the foreseeable future, which is bullying. We've already mentioned it a couple of times, but we're seeing some undoubtedly tragic situations. We're seeing students take their own lives, and often, at least in the media, it's reported that that is due to bullying. Um, what thoughts do you have around, or what advice do you have for schools in dealing with student bullying?
At the end of the day, it's all about relationships. You know, relationships are critical. And when something like this happens, it's because there's a breakdown of the relationship. And that relationship isn't at the end point where the two students or a group of students and one is suffering to the point where one says, look, I'd be much better off not being here. The relationships have broken down well before that. So this is the consequences of broken school systems, and I'd be quite frank here, of the failure of consecutive governments to actually stand up for their fundamental principles and what they believe is necessary. New Zealand and Australia are not dissimilar, and yet we seem to have this competition over who's going to lead, but no one actually stands up and says, well, this is what I believe in, and therefore this is what I will lead. So I feel sick for families that have had to endure this, and I feel sick for school communities that get their finger pointing at them for what is always a tragedy for everybody. And we need, as nations, to say, hey, this is where we stand and this is what we believe in, and we're going to make sure our institutions actually get on with the task of standing by those principles. And without that, we're just, as I said earlier on, we're band-aiding constantly, and it's dangerous for all, and no one benefits at the end of the day, when we should be aiming for everyone to benefit.
So what do principals need then?
Principals need the confidence to ask for help. They need the confidence to speak up about what they believe in, and they need to say, I really want to affect change, and this is how I'm going to go about it. And the first thing that they perhaps need to do is talk to people before making decisions about where the support would best lie for them to start affecting these changes. There are consultants everywhere. There are initiatives rolled out with government all the time. There's trends that are followed, and the overwhelming work of a school leader can be often that they are following the pack because it's, of the difficulties at play, or they become the victims of the bullying because they are trying to affect that change. So, I think it's time really now for school leaders to have the confidence to say, let's get back to basics, or as a friend of mine often says, forward to fundamentals, and start with those fundamental beliefs and first principles that will enable people like me and you to work in synergy with preventative and also growth that's required in all school settings.
It does just seem like a lose-lose situation at the moment from what I can see. Every time there's a case of bullying, no matter how it turns out, there are always allegations that the school didn't conduct a thorough enough investigation, didn't take the concerns of the parents seriously.
Correct.
Everything just seems to point back to the school, and I'm certainly not going to sit here and make comment on any individual cases because I don't know. But it just does seem to be a lose-lose situation for the families and for the schools.
Well, one of the challenges we have there, and if you're talking about what the media says, and also, through the work that we're doing, both of us, we have insufficient representation of families. We've got, schools with their associations and, you know, bottomless money, essentially from government and so forth. We've got students who are, not supported because we talked about this earlier, where they don't have representation away from either the school or the family unit. So individual representation independent of the parties, that's missing. And we certainly have a lack of input from families, albeit that there are parent associations around. They're so dependent on, once again, trying to create communities without robust conversations and looking at the difficult issues. We have very, very, very poor reporting right across the board as well.
I'd like to talk about disciplinary policies. Policy is something that I'm often talking to schools about because when I go in and run my workshops, I have a look at their bullying policies, their codes of conduct, the school rules, whatever you want to call it. Some of them are very, very good. Others are written in ways that are perhaps too vague. I wonder what comments you've got around what good disciplinary policy looks like when it comes to student behaviour.
Well, ultimately, we've got quite often, and I'm sure you would have seen this, these policies that say we will behave this way. This is the code of conduct or behaviours for the teaching staff. This is a code of conduct we expect of parents and of visitors to the school. This is a conduct we expect of students. And we've already got division. And we've already got tribalism just in that statement, those statements, rather than saying our community has debated and agreed to this. And when that happens, then there's no excuses for not knowing or abiding by. And if there is a breaking of those rules, then we come back to a level playing field that everyone understood, agreed to, and is working towards to the best of their ability. It would make your job so much easier.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here and suggest that sounds like an impossible task for a school principal or board to be able to get constant agreement across the whole student body, all the parents and all the teachers on what the school's values or code of conduct should be.
We had an example, a good example of this. We had it here in Victoria a number of years ago around hair length. And it was a private school. And
yes, I'm aware.
obviously. And there was an outcry because one of the teachers cut the student's hair at the school. And, this whole debate over did the school have the right to cut the student's hair, and did the parents have a right to, be outraged, et cetera, et cetera. Well, clearly there was, a long time between the hair being short to the hair being long before that cut occurred. That's the first thing. Secondly, where was the agreement or the conversation around the disagreement of what that, code was in terms of dress and representation of the school community? So again, it was once the scissors were out, the problem hit the media. But for how long was there, that lack of agreement, lack of understanding, lack of interest, lack of respect for the entire community, and lack of respect for the principles that school had, or flip it around, the lack of principles that the school had that needed to be put in place?
I was interacting with a school recently. They just had some professional learning, and of course, at this time of year, often school leaders are talking about things like values with the staff. And one of the comments that was that was made in that professional learning session was from a teacher was, well, these aren't my personal values. It's a waste of my time to sit here and have these values imposed on me. They're not my personal values. What would your response be to that situation?
Well, once again, what are people's personal values, and were they imposed? And if they were imposed, were they new? Had they been there for some time and not imposed? What was the process, or what were those principles and values upon employment for that person? Are there certain principles and values that we can agree to disagree, but have to follow within the school setting, be it that your life might be different outside of that? To use an example, Catholic schools welcome students who are not of Catholic faith. So, there must be a set of core principles and beliefs that the school adheres to and agrees to, and that student agrees to do so within the school community, making the rules easier. Parents have chosen that school, therefore, albeit that they're not of Catholic faith, you've chosen to be part of that community, they're the rules. If you choose to go to an Anglican church, or, Buddhist faith, or have no faith at all outside of that, that's in your private time. That's a separate issue. So if we're going to talk about values, we have to be very mindful that we have to be open to these debates, but in the first instance, identify what our end game is and know where we are at the beginning in order to achieve that end game. One PD session is not going to cut it. That's the first thing. And rushing to create something certainly doesn't help anybody, particularly when there's difference.
Yeah, I think in a situation like that, from my perspective at least, there needs to be a conversation with a staff member who's thinking like that around exactly what you just said, which is when you sign up to come and work here, you're aware of what the values are of our school, what we stand for. So you kind of you put on that identity as you walk through it when you walk through the school gate, I guess, in one sense.
Absolutely. And, again, it comes back to whether they were there or not. The um, scenario raises more questions, in essence, than providing a simple answer. There is no answer without exactly what you do, investigate. It'd be meaningless to provide an answer without knowing more.
Yeah, I guess ultimately what you and I are trying to do is prevent schools from ever getting into those situations where they need investigation in the first place. Hence
Exactly.
the
Exactly.
the necessity for conversations like this.
That's right. I mean, when I owned a long daycare centre and had to interview staff, new staff, the first interview, one of three, was just to invite the person to come along and have a wander around the facilities, find out how long it took them to get there, so that you knew that if they they arrived relaxed, or if they arrived stressed because of the travel time and their family commitments and so forth, how they presented themselves and what my expectations were of presentation, and so forth. And very respectfully, on both parties. Some would say, oh, look, it's not what I thought it would be, and I could say the same thing, and not perhaps in those words. But, if you're wanting to be part of a community, we have to learn to compromise as well as get our own way.
I was interacting with a teacher recently who was employed by a school that was faith-based, and this teacher had essentially uh, joined the school because of the pay and because they were nice people to work with. But after being there for 6 months or a year, had decided that they didn't really agree with the way the school was expressing its faith. There was some stuff in there about gender and sexuality. There are also some things in there around the Christian denomination that was represented at that school, and this teacher was essentially saying that they hated the school, hated being part of it, but were planning to stay there anyway because the pay was so good.
Well, it's a very sad scenario, isn't it? And unfortunately, it does exist. Fortunately, it doesn't exist everywhere with all
Hmm.
educators, because predominantly educators are committed to doing their best for school communities. However, it does happen. And that needs to be stamped out, because that's not what education is about, certainly not what school education is about. And to be honest with you, if it was an environment that you didn't like and weren't happy with, oh my God, why would you want to be there? How miserable. That comes back to that personal fulfillment that we spoke of earlier. Not, it just doesn't help anyone, least of all the
No,
person.
yeah, and I think ultimately who's going to lose is the students.
Well, everyone loses, no one benefits.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, Cheryl. Well, as we bring this discussion to a close, I want to thank you for your time. And there's a lot. I've got questions. And what's great about this is I don't necessarily agree with everything you've said. I don't think there's some things that I'm going to have to go away and ponder. But that's the fantastic thing about having these sorts of discussions. I love this because we're able to throw different ideas around and get different perspectives. And as you say, that is actually a healthy culture to try and develop. So thank you for being willing to share your thoughts. I wonder if you have any final thoughts before we finish off, final thoughts for anyone in the school sector who might be watching or listening to this.
Certainly. It's really, really critical that we take our time to establish these fundamental principles and beliefs, so that we do have a community that we can focus on what we're really there for. And that is consistency across a school system or country, but offering our unique perspectives and capabilities so that there are choices for people to make. However, we must have a really strong focus on having a deadline at which we determine that we're going to have all of this bedded down, so that we again can get on with what it is that school systems are there for. It can be challenging, but that's the healthy part. Exactly what you said, Tim. You and I won't always agree, but my God, I respect what you do. And having respect at the outset is certainly a great way to have healthy relationships, even when we disagree.
Cheryl, for those who are watching this, they probably already know who I am and the work that we do at Basalt Solutions, so people know where to find me, basaltsolutions.com. But if anyone's interested in finding out more about the work that you do, where do you want to send them?
CherylLacey.com, nice and simple.
Fantastic. And no doubt we'll put some links and those sorts of things in notes and posts and all that sort of carry on. But thank you very much for your time, and I really look forward to catching up again.
Terrific, thanks. Good on you.